We've all been there, right? That in the zone feeling, like you're totally absorbed in something and time just flies by.
It's a powerful feeling.
Totally. But what's wild is that this feeling of flow, we can actually like measure it and study it scientifically.
It's pretty amazing what we can do these days. And that's
Oh.
actually what we're diving into today, that state of deep focus, total immersion, where you're just like firing on all cylinders. We're calling it task absorption.
How are we going to break this down?
Well, we're looking at this super interesting study that used a game to try and understand how our brains and bodies react in those high engagement moments.
Wait, a game. Okay, now you have my attention. What kind of game are we talking about?
It's called the beer distribution game, and it's been around for like decades.
Yeah.
Business schools love it. Basically, it simulates a supply chain. So you're managing how beer flows from the brewery to the consumer. But you'd be surprised how complex it can get. You make decisions about inventory, orders, distribution. It's a whole thing.
I bet. And you said like everyone from CEOs to students have played this.
Oh yeah, it's a classic. And that's why it's such a powerful tool to study, like decision-making under pressure. What's cool about this study is they paired the beer distribution game with eye-tracking tech.
Now that's just cool. So they were literally watching people's eyes while they played this beer game.
Exactly. They were tracking how pupil diameter changes.
Hold on. So our pupils, they can tell us something about how focused we are.
You got it. Our pupils actually dilate when we're super engaged, like really focused on something. It's a subtle thing, but it's a pretty solid indicator of like how absorbed we are in that moment.
Wow. So they could actually see people's eyes light up as they got into the game. That's so cool.
It really is. And what they found could really help us figure out how to create environments and strategies that encourage this kind of task absorption.
That makes sense. Because if we can tap into that more often, think about it. Better performance, maybe even less stress and burnout.
Totally.
Okay, I'm sold. So let's back up for a sec. How do we even define task absorption? Like, what's it actually feel like?
Okay, picture this. You're so into what you're doing, you totally lose track of time. You're not thinking about anything else, just completely in the zone, like one with a task. That's task absorption. And it's been studied in all sorts of fields, from athletes to artists.
Right, it's that flow state, right, where everything just clicks.
Exactly. And the researchers found a direct link between this state of task absorption and how well people did in the beer distribution game. Basically, the more absorbed the players were, the better their decisions, the better their results overall.
So being in the flow actually gives you a measurable advantage.
It does. And here's where things get even more interesting. This study also brought in something called the Job Demands Resources Theory, or JDR theory.
Okay, break that down for me. What is that?
Think of it like a framework to understand, like, the core characteristics of any job, or any task for that matter. It basically says every job has demands, things that require effort, that can lead to stress, right? But they're also resources, things that help us achieve our goals and reduce stress.
So the demands are the challenges and the resources are what help us overcome them.
Exactly. But what's interesting is that this study focused on how those demands and resources can change, even within a single task. Think about a challenging project at work.
Oh yeah, I've been there.
Right. So maybe at some points you're feeling totally swamped, like the demands are just too much. But then things shift, you get the support you need, and suddenly you're in the groove, feeling energized, focused.
So it's not just about the overall demands and resources, it's how they like ebb and flow throughout the task.
Exactly. And that's a big part of what affects our ability to get into that flow state.
I'm seeing the connection here.
What they found was that having a higher level of those, what we call episodic job resources, clear goals, supportive teammates, the right tools, it actually led to better performance in the beer distribution game. But here's the kicker. Task absorption is like the key that unlocks it all.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. So more resources lead to more absorption, and that leads to better performance.
Exactly. It's like this chain reaction. And it gets even cooler. They found something called a moderation effect. That means that the positive impact of those resources on task absorption, it's even stronger when the demands are high.
So if you're working on something super challenging, but you've got a great team, clear goals, all the resources you need, that's the recipe for flow.
You got it. It seems counterintuitive, but sometimes a bit of a challenge with the right support can push us to do our best work.
This is amazing.
So we just explored this whole idea of task absorption and how it can actually make us better at what we do.
Totally. And we talked about how those demands and resources we face, those can make a big difference in whether or not we actually get into that flow state.
Right. So now let's get down to brass tacks.
Huh.
How do we use this? Like, how can we actually make this work for us?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And what can we actually do to tap into this power of task absorption?
Well, the cool thing is that this research, it's got some seriously practical implications. Like, by understanding the things that help us get absorbed in a task, we can create environments and strategies that, help us achieve that state more often.
So let's say you're a manager and you want to see your team find that flow state more often. What can you do?
One of the biggest takeaways is the importance of having the right resources at the right time. So that could be things like making sure your team has really clear goals, giving them the tools and info they need to do their jobs well, or even just creating a supportive environment where they feel comfortable asking questions and seeking help.
Makes sense. I mean, it's tough to lose yourself in something if you're constantly second-guessing yourself or feeling lost, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And remember that moderation effect we talked about. Those resources, they become even more crucial when the demands are high. So if your team's tackling a super challenging project, it's even more important to make sure they have the support they need to knock it out of the park.
More resources, more absorption, better results. I'm starting to see a pattern here, but what about those demands? Is there anything we can actually do about those?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we can't always control the demands we face, that's for sure, but we can definitely learn to handle them better. One strategy is to just break those complex tasks down into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Bite-sized pieces, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Sometimes that's all it takes. Just breaking things down into smaller steps. It prevents that feeling of being overwhelmed and makes it so much easier to find your flow.
What about time management? That's got to play a big role too, right? If you're constantly getting interrupted, that's got to be hard to focus.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost impossible to reach that level of deep focus when you're getting bombarded with distractions. Creating those blocks of uninterrupted time where you can just focus on the task at hand, that's super valuable.
Oh man, distractions are my kryptonite. Email, social media, that to-do list that never seems to end.
It's a struggle. But honestly, even small changes can make a big difference. Try turning off those notifications, or maybe schedule specific times to check email. See if that helps.
I'm definitely going to try that. But I also wonder, like, how much of this is just individual? Some people just seem to be naturally better at focusing than others.
Right, there's definitely individual variation there. So while the study focused on those external factors, we have to remember we all have different strengths and weaknesses when it comes to focus and attention.
So what works for one person might not work for everyone.
Exactly. Some people find mindfulness or meditation helpful for training their attention. Others, they might need to create a specific workspace that minimizes distractions. It's all about finding what works best for you.
Speaking of finding what works, this study also brings up the importance of feedback.
Oh, absolutely. Getting feedback on how we're doing, it can be super motivating. It keeps us engaged in the task. And it can also help us figure out where we might need more support or resources.
It's like in those video games where you get points or rewards for completing certain tasks. It keeps you going.
Exactly. And it doesn't even have to be external feedback. We can give ourselves that internal feedback by setting personal goals, tracking our progress, celebrating those wins.
This is all making so much sense. By being more mindful of the demands, the resources, those strategies we talked about, we can create those conditions for task absorption to happen more often. And that, in turn, leads to better performance and hopefully less stress and burnout.
Right. Now, I find super fascinating this whole idea of using eye tracking tech to actually measure task absorption.
I know. It's wild to think we can actually see those changes in pupil diameter as people get more focused and engaged.
It's like we're peeking into their minds.
Yeah.
And remember that surprising finding. That biggest pupil dilation happened when there were both high demands and high resources.
Right. It's like our brains actually thrive on challenge.
It's true. It kind of challenges this idea that we should always try to avoid demands and just go for the easiest option. Sometimes a good challenge, with the right support, can actually help us unlock our full potential.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where we're pushing ourselves, but we've also got the resources and support to step up to the challenge. This has been so insightful. Okay, so we've uncovered a ton about this whole task absorption thing, how it connects to performance, those demands and resources that shape it, even some strategies to help us find that flow state more often. But before we wrap things up, are there any caveats to this research we should keep in mind?
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I mean, the study, it gives us some really cool insights, but It's important to acknowledge its limitations, right?
Yeah.
Like, for instance, the sample size, it was pretty small. They only looked at 18 managers.
So we can't necessarily say these findings would apply to everyone or every type of task.
Right. It would be super interesting to see if we get similar results with a more diverse group of people, like maybe folks from different industries, different roles.
And the whole study was based on the beer distribution game, which, as insightful as it is still just a simulation.
Yeah, that's true. It does a great job of mirroring real-world decision-making, but it's not quite the same as, like, observing people in their actual work environments, right? So I think it would be awesome to see future research explore task absorption in more realistic settings, just to confirm these findings hold up in, like, everyday scenarios.
I've also been thinking about the long-term impact of all this. Like, we've talked about how task absorption can boost performance, but could there be any downsides?
That's a great question and a really important one. I mean, task absorption is definitely a good thing. But like anything, too much of a good thing can be, well, too much. If we're constantly in that hyper-focused state, we might start neglecting other important areas of our lives, our relationships, our health, even just taking breaks to recharge.
Right, gotta have some balance.
Exactly. We got to be aware of our own limits, make sure we're not burning ourselves out in the pursuit of, peak performance.
It makes you wonder what else we could learn about this whole phenomenon.
Totally. This study was really focused on the external stuff, those demands and resources we talked about. But there's a whole internal world to consider too, right? Personality traits, motivation levels, even our mood on any given day, all of that can play a role.
So it's like nature versus nurture, but for focus. How much is just how we're wired, and how much is shaped by our experiences?
Such a fascinating question. And I think that's a prime area for future research. Like, if we can understand how those internal and external factors work together, it could give us an even deeper understanding of how to unlock that flow state more often.
Man, this deep dive has really given us a lot to chew on.
It really has. I mean, this research lays a great foundation for understanding task absorption, but it really is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. What can you do to increase your own task absorption in the things that really matter to you?
Think about it. Maybe it's about carving out dedicated time for focused work. Maybe it's minimizing those distractions or seeking out support when you need it. Or maybe it's just about choosing to engage in activities that you find truly meaningful and challenging.
Whatever it is, we encourage you to take what we've discussed today and see how you can apply it to your own life.
Because when we understand the science behind flow, we unlock the potential to do some truly amazing things.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds engaged.